All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll just be getting started here in a moment. So as Kate mentioned, we have our second panel starting up pretty soon. It'll carry us right through to lunch. So this panel is on perspectives on environmental stewardship, and we have three panelists representing, well, you know, not to be too direct about things, but I think it represents three generations of perspectives on environmental stewardship. And so we're really excited to have this opportunity to continue our conversation. I do believe that from what I've heard and talking with our panelists previously, prior to today's meeting, I think that we're going to be covering some material that's overlapping and adjacent to what we've already heard in the shifting politics session this morning. So those of you who've had your appetites, you know, whetted with this discussion that we've had thus far, there will be ample opportunities to kind of deepen and extend our conversation during this panel. As Kate mentioned, if you were already jumping up and heading for more coffee or the break, we are going to have breakout sessions at the end of our meetings today, and that'll provide more opportunities to get up close and speak individually or in small groups with our panelists. So just be sure that you're keeping your notes and your questions ready, and if we don't have time during these sessions, we'll definitely have opportunities to follow up and talk more during the breakout sessions. All right, so environmental stewardship. A couple of interesting words in there, of course. What is the environment? What does it constitute? If we're thinking about resources, are we thinking about landscapes? Are we thinking about cultural knowledge? Whether that be indigenous knowledge, the knowledge of the tribal nations in Montana, the knowledge that comes from the everyday experiences of working the land, scientific and technical knowledge, all these things relating to the environment that relate to resources, the economy, management of resources, access to resources. So I think these are all topics that we're going to be hearing about in the not too distant future here. So our first panelist is known perhaps to many here in this room. If you've been involved with the Montana State University community for any period of time, you may have heard of Professor Terry Anderson. Professor Anderson has been a professor here at Montana State in the Department of Economics for some period of time, is now Professor Emeritus, and is also a senior fellow, the John and Jean DeNault Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So I can call Terry a colleague at my home university as well. And Terry is a widely published author. I almost fell out of my chair when I read that he's the author of 43 books, which is a remarkable record. And his research is focused on topics such as free markets and the relationship between free markets and environmentalism. And naturally, as an economist, I think a lot of this work intersected as well with questions regarding institutions, property rights, and, of course, then resource management, which is going to be part of what we think about when we think about environmental stewardship. And he's more recently, and I've had the pleasure of hearing a little bit more about this last year, he's been hard at work on projects relating to the evolution of Native American property rights institutions and ideas about renewing indigenous economies. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, and of course, Fly Fisherman as well here in Montana. And I think then, without further ado, I'd like to invite Terry, if you'd like to step up to the podium, and you've got up to 20 minutes. So we've go ahead and take us away, get us started.
In case your Latin isn't very good, that emeritus just is a word for old. But I did have a great career here and even see a few familiar faces from that career. My biggest claim to fame, though, is walking into the Two Bassett Brewery, which I'll talk about later, in White Sulphur Springs, Montana, and the person who owns it said, "Did you teach econ at MSU?" And I get beer there all the time now. One of the few perks that came with my job. So it's a great honor to be here. Ivan Doig I've met, but only know from reading his works. And surely, in a way, much of what Ivan has written about fits what I want to conclude in my remarks here. But I want to start with just how there we go, it is working, how I got into some of these ideas on the West. It wasn't just that I came from a little town south of Billings, Bridger. Note I didn't say I grew up, because I didn't. But I was born and raised in Bridger and knew a rural community. And I'd never thought about writing about the West. I went to graduate school at the University of Washington. It's a farm club of the University of Chicago, and I wasn't good enough to get in there. But I did learn markets work, and that was sort of the mantra of Chicago and Washington. And so I wrote about lots of different topics in economics, but I really got interested in the West when my colleague at the time, P.J. Hill, who was a fourth-generation rancher from Eccles, actually Powderville, and P.J. and I had simultaneously been watching a PBS series called America, and in that, Alistair Cook, the narrator, had a sentence in which he said, all the problems in the West centered around who owned the land, who owned the water, and who owned the cattle. And PJ and I came back together at our office over in Linfield Hall shortly thereafter and said, we ought to do something on that. And it launched us on a project that ultimately resulted in a book called The Not So Wild, Wild West. And I want to talk about why it wasn't so wild. But it was a Wild West, largely because the questions that Alistair Cook raised weren't addressed totally. It was a battle over the Indians' rights to buffalo and the cowboys wanting the grass. It was battles over cowboys and sheep herders. The cowboys eventually were displaced by barbed wire. They put up barbed wire and then came along, and I underscored the last part of the word, herders. They didn't need barbed wire because they herded the animals that they owned. And it was in that context, this battle over who owned fill in the blank, that created what was the Wild West. And PJ and I wrote about what really tamed the West, and it was to solve many of the problems that were there in the Alistair Cook questions, and they were dealt with by small communities, small groups of people who came together, cattlemen's associations, and mining camps, and so on. And the question I want to raise, I'd be happy to talk more about the Wild West and the taming of that West, but I want to raise the question of, will the West be wild again? And to do so, I want to first just think about, again, why it was wild. This is a Charlie Russell painting of what I wished I could have been. In fact, I will put on my hat anyway. I wished I could have been a cowboy riding a horse like that, not necessarily roping a wolf, but that was cowboy sport, as Charlie Russell wrote about it. And this notion of how the cowboys viewed wolves was a part of taming the West as far as the cowboys were concerned. We economists are always worried about the optimal amount of things, The cowboys thought we had the optimal amount of things until somebody came along and said, well, why don't we reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone? Wouldn't that be a good idea? Well, the only good wolf is a dead wolf. Was a bumper sticker that was sported on many cars, at many pickups probably, when wolves were being reintroduced. And it was, in a sense, kind of bringing back this notion of the Wild West. And in fact, I have quite a few hats. I'll put on my environmentalist hat, which I borrowed from my good friend Hank Fisher. Hank and I became good friends during the wolf reintroduction. And Hank told the story of going down to Ashton, Idaho, to try and sell this idea of wolf reintroduction to the sheep herders around Ashton. And he said he went into the local cafe for the Rotary Club or whatever it was, and he said he didn't even get any words out of his mouth. He stood up and said, "Ain't nobody killed you yet?" And I thought, that's the Wild West, right? Poor Hank was up before a sea of these things, and he knew he had a hard sell. But Hank and I became good friends because a willing buyer, willing seller, the sense that I came out of graduate school with, which was, let markets work, make it markets. And Hank understood that really the question was, who had the right? Did, at that time, Defenders of Wildlife, the group he worked for, did they and the other people who wanted them have the right to have wolves out there roaming free, or did the cattle people and livestock people have a right to be free from predation? And I learned more from Hank than he learned from me, but the economics in me said, well, you're asking them to pay for a lunch for your wolves, and they're not going to like that. And he said, well, I can fix that. And he Defenders published this, printed this poster, and sold them for, I think, $50 initially. They raised a ton of money, and they put that money into a bank and started a trust fund in a Missoula bank and said, if you have livestock killed by wolves, we'll pay for it. And they even had the Montana Livestock Board certify whether it was a wolf kill or not. So if it happened to be the neighbor's German Shepherd that got loose and killed your cow, they weren't going to pay for that. But if it was a wolf, they would pay for it. And Hank became a star for me in the work that I later did, Free Market Environmentalism, a book that Don Leal, my co-author, and I did 3 editions of. Don't wait for the 4th, because it ain't going to happen. But in that, we held Hank on this pedestal as an example of how you can keep the West from being the Wild West again. And Hank dismissed amongst the Ashton-type people the notion that he should be killed. And I again, I've got lots of examples I could talk about, but I want to keep it close to home here, and say when I heard about American Prairie, then American Prairie Reserve, which actually I was sitting on an airplane and I was on the aisle seat, and the aisle seat in front of me was Sean Garrity, one of the founders of the organization. And Sean had these really cool pictures in his lap, and I was stretching my head trying to see what they were. Could tell they were pretty pictures of eastern Montana. And I said, what's this all about? And he started to tell me about the American Prairie. And he said, and we're willing buyer, willing seller. And I said, man, this is my kind of guy. This is a Hank Fisher kind of guy. And so I was a big supporter of, not financially necessarily, but intellectually a supporter of American Prairie. But I've had sort of an awakening, and it came as in the more recent times as they dropped reserve part and now American Prairie. And I'm going back to White Sulphur Springs for a moment. My wife Monica and I decided, well, I pretty much decided I needed a place outside the Bozeman bubble or Los Angeles. So we bought a second home up by White Sulphur Springs. And boy, up there I kept seeing Save the Cowboy. I didn't know the cowboy was on the endangered species list, but I was kind of a cowboy. We had horses and felt comfortable around them, and we really felt comfortable in the Two Bassett Brewery because they were all cowboys. And I realized that not everybody saw the American prairie as this great institution of willing buyer, willing seller. And of course, the American prairie, which thought this was going to be, and Sean and I had many discussions about this, I said, yeah, I think you might run into a buzzsaw out there in eastern Montana. Well, eventually the frontier that we were talking about early on moved to Washington. And American prairie recently found out that it ain't quite so easy. And if you followed the press and the results of their efforts to turn the cattle grazing permits into buffalo grazing permits, you saw headlines like this one from the Bozeman Chronicle, "No buffalo on BLM." And American Prairie said, this is crazy. What do you mean? First off, you've been grazing buffalo on BLM lands for a long time, and why us? And the answer was politics. And you know, these two quotes, I think, capture just how what the battle is all about today. And I want to, I'm not going to give my confessions quite yet. My mentor, this elf here, Douglas North, who later won the Nobel Prize in economics, a great mentor. He taught me a good deal of economics, but I wasn't around him as much in the latter part of his career when he started writing about culture. And what I realized after I read more of Doug's work was that this battle in the American prairie versus Save the Cowboy was not so much over was there going to be an animal eating grass and would that animal be a buffalo or a cow. It was much more about what Doug describes in this quote, culture. It was about these shared beliefs that we have, these shared values, norms, and the list goes on as he puts them. And the more I'm around the Two Bassett Brewery, the more I realize that it's a cultural battle. It's not really about should we have buffalo or cows. It's not even really about was the short grass prairie being destroyed by the cattle. It's really about culture. And I want to just talk a little bit in my confessions here about how I have started thinking about culture, and I wish Doug were still alive. I'd be sitting at his feet learning more about it from him. But what I realized was, as a free market environmentalist, a free market economist, that I really like markets. They work. Riley said, bribery is efficient. I was just like, whoa, I like that phrase. Well, not quite, but it's what we economists care about. I used to teach when I taught here, if I raised my hands as if directing the choir, the class knew the answer to whatever I'd asked was, if marginal benefits are greater than marginal costs, do it. And that's efficiency. So willing buyer, willing seller is just efficiency at work, markets at work. Isn't that wonderful? And you get gains from trade, and you end up with trade rather than fighting, raiding I use. And here I didn't keep this in the deck, but I have this great other Charlie Russell painting of a cowboy and a Native American on horseback, and the cowboy is holding up two fingers, and the title of that painting is The Toll. Cowboys understood. It's their land. You're crossing their land with your cows, and you pay a toll. And in the background are a few other braves who are cutting out 2 or however many, whatever the price was. So we got trade rather than raiding. But since the title of this session has rethinking in it, I want to take my confession out of me rethinking free market environmentalism and the notion of if it's willing buyer, willing seller, that's great. And it's because nobody owns the culture. And when nobody owns something, you end up with a lot of fighting over it. And moreover, the American prairie example involves a great deal of public land. 80% of the 3.2 million acres they propose to save the shortgrass prairie is public land. And public land, I call it political land, because that's a better way to understand what's going on, and American Prairie has gotten a quick lesson in politics of public land management. So my question is then, is there a way to avoid returning to the Old West? One of my favorite postcards from the Montana series you may have seen is these two ranchers discussing water rights, a Western pastime. Is there any way to avoid falling back into the trap of the Old West? And I want to leave you with a few of my thoughts on what I think we need to do as we think about trying to use, in my case, free market environmentalism to solve these problems. First off, I think we forget that culture is a social thing. And I'm sorry if I keep going back to Two Bassett, but it's good beer, by the way. But Two Bassett is a social place, and it's a social place where people get together and they communicate with one another and they talk about their culture. They know what their culture is. And in fact, I remember first when we went over there, I was sitting at the local bakery one Sunday morning while Monica was off praying for me. And a couple walked by, and they looked down at me and they said, "You're not from here, are you?" This was about like, ain't nobody killed you yet. I hadn't gotten that far down the path, but I said, "No." "Where are you from?" "Bozeman." They still were willing to talk, and I told them, well, but I came from Bridger, and that gave me some creds. But it was this sort of social event with them that was important to become part of their community. And culture it has to have that social event. And I'm going to pick on American Prairie a little. I've done that in my Pulitzer Prize-winning column in the Marr County News. And say that when American Prairie came in, and again when I met Sean Garrity, I understood that they were saying, we want 3.2 million acres. Well, even a Montanan has to say that's a pretty big spread. And I think they came in without spending time at the Two Bassett Brewery. And then culture isn't something you just come in and say, well, you need a new culture. Your old one's broke. Fix it. Ask the legislators what happens if you do that in the legislature. And so culture has to evolve. And again, I think often with free market environmentalism, because it's pretty easy to make the transactions that American Prairie made. They made them. They've made a lot of them quickly. They own 600,000 acres of land in eastern Montana now. That's not a bad spread itself. But but it happened rather quickly, and I think it was the speed at which the American Prairie movement took off that has left culture in its wake. And culture is very local. And when you say 3 million acres, that's not very local. It's not local if you live in White Sulphur or Lewistown or Bozeman. It's a big amount of land. And I think by going so big, it left in its wake, again, a culture of ranch sizes that were well known and understood for why they should be that. And finally, culture is something that is learned. And I yesterday had lunch with my friend and colleague, P.J. Hill, and we started chatting about what I was going to talk about today. And he said, so do you just think we should tell the ranchers they can't sell their land to American Prairie? And I said, well, I'm going to lose my free market credentials quickly if I make that argument, so I'm not going to argue that. He said, well, what do you think about corner crossing? I said, I oppose it. He said, why? And I said, well, because there are property rights involved. You got this X out there and some posts and public land on two sides, private land on the other, and if you're going to cross that corner unless you're infinitely small, you're going to trespass. And he said, yeah, but Montana law is pretty clear. You can cross through that space. Airplanes fly over it all the time. What do you think? And I said, God, that's a great point. And then I said, wait a minute. Why do I think you shouldn't corner cross? It's because my mom and dad told me, growing up in Bridger, that I shouldn't trespass. That I was okay to go hunting, but not on old lady Jones's land because I didn't have permission to be on that land. And I said, that was a part of a culture I learned. I never thought about it until lunch yesterday. That culture came to me because my parents taught it to me, And I learned it, and I abide by it to this day. I would not corner cross if the biggest bull elk I'd ever seen were standing on the other side of a line that I couldn't cross. And I end with these 4 points about culture as what I think I, as a free market environmentalist, forgot all about. If it's a market transaction and you buy it, it's yours, take it and run. And I think if we do that with markets, then we lose sight of culture, which is an important part of what I think rethinking the environmental stewardship is all about. My email is here. I don't have any, I was the one person who raised the hand about having a social media account, but I do have an email account. I use it regularly. Write it down, send me an email. I'm happy to engage in conversations with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Terry. That was fantastic. And there's something new every day. An economist ending with a slide full of cultural observations, absolutely fantastic. So that's a great start to our panel. And next up, in the order that I have here in my program, we have Julia Haggerty. Professor Julia Haggerty is a geographer, but also a historian. So I like that. And is the head of the Department of Earth Sciences here at Montana State University. She holds a PhD from the University of Colorado in history and a BA in liberal arts from Colorado College. So definitely bringing the representation here of the Colorado educational, the higher ed system, all the way up here to Montana State. Dr. Haggerty's expertise has focused on community-engaged, place-based research, which I have to say, I think that's really at the cutting edge of what we're seeing in the kind of social scientific / humanistic approaches to environmental studies. So really leading the charge here in developing these research methods, very important. A lot of focus on tribal economic community development and natural resource and energy issues. So like I promised at the outset, we're going to be talking about resources or access to land, property rights, things of that nature. When we think about environmental stewardship, these are major issues. Her research has been supported by a lot of both internal and external support, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, Sloan Foundation. Dr. Haggerty was a 2020 Fulbright Global Scholar and has also won awards from the Association of American Geographers. And I don't know, Julia, were you in SF just last week for, we could have crossed paths there. Love it when I'm able to meet with geographers. So she's a university fellow at Resources for the Future and co-leads the Resilient Energy Economies Initiative and is also active in numerous national and international boards and takes part in large studies. So without further ado, Julia, I'd like to invite you to step forward as you have planned. Okay, let's do it.
Does this work? Okay, great. I might just launch off of here. So I'm seeking, thank you for being here with me as I reclaim this space. The last time I was on this stage in any duration of speaking was when I taught human geography in the fall of 2020 to 185 students in masks who sat in chairs, individual desk chairs, 6 feet apart, one from the next. And on stage, I had a big plastic shield and a mask. It's hard enough to teach a lecture on human geography to 200 people. It's really hard to do it under those circumstances. So my sense in sitting through the first panel was like, stage is terrible. There's just something that makes us too far apart, even though we're close together. Something I want to do to start is just to recognize, if you would stand up, if you do not come to MSU every day because you're a student or a faculty member. So if you're here as someone visiting us, please stand up. This is so exciting to have all of you here. And I'm going to ask if you are from out of state to sit down. So if you're a Montanan who's here on campus to be here for this event, we're so glad you're here. I wish we did it more. I wish we had you here more. It's far away. I think some of you have probably come from really far distances, but I see also some familiar faces of people I know who work in Bozeman in the nonprofit community, and I know what your days are like. I know that giving up a day to be here is a big undertaking, so I hope you're getting what you need out of this, and I encourage you, it just feels way too quiet in here. You can sit down. Get your phones out, text each other, have side conversations. It just feels a little stale and quiet in here, and I'm looking forward to the afternoon. So I'm not talking about property rights today, Zephyr. I am here as a representative of a project that no longer exists, and that is the Mountains and Plains Thriving Communities Collaborative. This was, for me, one of the most important professional goals and accomplishments of my life was to bring this center to Montana State University with a whole bunch of partners. I spent my sabbatical writing the first proposal to put this together and collaborating, I should say, with land grants in all of the states that you can see featured on the map, as well as a number of other partners. The first proposal failed. We wrote a second proposal, and we won this center, which was one of 18 Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers funded really through congressional appropriation as a vision from the US EPA about how we could meet the needs of underserved, particularly rural in our region, rural and tribal communities. So when I think about what we want to talk about in what is environmental stewardship, I think this project really exemplified the ideas of what kinds of problems communities are bringing to us in terms of their environmental and climate stewardship needs and how we might respond to them. So even though this project was canceled as one of the first sacrificial symbolic acts of the new administration last January, I think the model is really powerful, and to the extent that we can use the kinds of projects that we were supporting in our Technical Assistance Center to hear the voices of communities. That's what I'll try to do briefly here. So the Tic Tacs, as they were known, were really about addressing climate and environmental justice challenges. So Region 8 are the 6 states that were shown on the previous map, and these are just some examples of the kinds of persistent environmental and climate challenges that we find in the region. Chris Smith, who's here from Headwaters Economics, could give me the exact statistic on where Montana is in terms of the risk that low-income neighborhoods in manufactured housing face nationally from flooding. This is both in our smaller urban centers and in rural areas. So there are a lot of really serious challenges in our region, and really they come out of 2 interconnected challenges. The idea that there are certain geographies that are experiencing and have experienced a larger share of negative environmental impacts, and historically, many of those communities have lacked the capacity and access to participate in the politics and decision-making that affect resource use. And then we have just systemic and historic underinvestment in all of the kinds of capacities that make places resilient to the kinds of environmental and climate challenges they face. And these circumstances are worse, and the worst often in places where people of color live and people who are socioeconomically marginalized. So that's true across Region 8. It's true across Montana. The Tic Tacs nationally sought to solve this, and what was pretty exciting about the model, and what makes it kind of ironic that it was such a poster child to be cut in the beginning of the last administration, is that the agencies that were seeking to address environmental issues in the West knew for decades that the programs they had weren't working. The funding amounts they had to help solve environmental justice problems in communities were too small. The processes of applying for and winning support for these projects were too complicated. So this was actually a really brilliant strategy that came out of bureaucracy as a way for bureaucracy to escape its problems and develop a system that would put money into trusted partners in the regions to be sources of support for communities who had access to much greater funding delivered in less complicated streams to solve the kinds of problems that they wanted to work on. So the focus of our center was really about building capacity to problem solve. So to come up with ideas, to write proposals, to win funding, to address community initiatives and concerns. And then this was coupled with this really phenomenal grant program that also worked through trusted partners to get the federal government kind of out of the middle of connecting communities with the resources that they needed. So our vision was really to meet communities where they were. And what I want to just do is really just go through a list of, so we existed, and my really cherished project manager, Ben Williamson, is who did a lot of this work after I sort of put together the proposal and the ideas, is here in the front of the room if you want to condole him or console him or meet with him. He got, and his team, got an amazing amount done in the 7 months that we operated. We reached a couple hundred different organizations all across the 6 states, the 28 tribal nations. We were really beginning to build a huge network that connected our contacts through the region, and we were successful in helping some of our participants win grants. And what I thought I would do is just go through the list of some of the projects that we supported, and what I want you to hear in this list or listen for are what are the expressions of what environmental and climate stewardship looks like in remote and tribal communities around Region 8. One of the things that you already heard about in Zach Brown's slide was a beautiful community center in Petroleum County, which, by the way, a big chunk of that money came from a private donation from someone who had left town and made their fortune in oil and gas and came back. Not all communities have those kind of benefactors with the deep pockets to build those community centers, but almost every community wants a community center that looks like that. So a number of the projects that came across our desk were projects asking for some kind of climate resilience hub. And when you hear that, it sounds like very Biden-y and very, I don't know, it already sounds out of date. But what you could think about is the folks in Prairie County out in eastern Montana who talk about their concern that livestock will burn up in wildfires and trying to understand how they can get an indoor facility added to their fairgrounds that can be a climate refuge for animals during wildfires. So these are rural, conservative places coming to us for support to work on climate resilience with projects like that. One of my favorite projects when we were really busy in grant supporting time, we all kind of put in hours at night meeting with project proponents who needed help with their grants. I took the Sunday evening shift because I was still teaching and doing all my normal stuff during the day. And so Sunday evenings I would get on Zoom and people would drop in to get support with their grant proposals. And one of the proposals I really enjoyed supporting was a proposal in Riverton, Wyoming. Adjacent on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And in Riverton, recycling is done by a nonprofit. And I might get some of the details wrong because I didn't check them last night, but The nonprofit that does the recycling also serves as a community partner in delivering day programs for severely disabled, cognitively disabled tribal adults. So what they wanted was a state-of-the-art recycling trash pickup vehicle so that they could expand their program, which took cognitively disabled adults from the reservation out into the community, giving them meaningful work. So I have a developmentally disabled brother. These issues are really dear to me, and this strikes me as like the kind of multi-solving that you want to see in communities that is so powerful, and there just isn't money in the tax base to buy that recycling truck. And Terry, markets are not going to solve this. These are places where we really need to come in as neighbors to these places and provide support and resources. So we have like a long list here. I'll give a couple of others. On the Rocky Boy Reservation, we supported the Chippewa Cree tribe seeking funding for a sewer extension project, which would replace failing septic systems that were causing water contamination and health hazards. This is environmental stewardship. In Livingston, we helped the city work on an application for a stormwater utility to address flooding and water quality issues that disproportionately affect low-income residents. Working with the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe in South Dakota, we helped secure funding for an energy efficiency project that included comprehensive energy surveys for residential and commercial buildings so that they could plan future renewable energy investments. And then one of my favorites from this list is good old Webo County, Montana. So just thinking about rural politics, Webo County is the county, one of the counties that has banned wind energy development. Renewable energy in eastern Montana, as it is nationally, has become a real kind of dog whistle issue and a place where we can put ideologies about our party differences into decisions about infrastructure. But we worked there, and what proponents in Webo County were working on was just addressing the food desert issues in their community. So all of these are examples of the kinds of challenges that rural, tribal communities, kind of regardless of political orientation, are bringing and saying, these are our environmental stewardship challenges. We would like support and help in solving these problems. So here's a couple of testimonials from people we supported who talked about and so why would MSU do this, and why is it important for a university to do this? I believe that we worked with all the land-grant universities and a number of other partners. I truly believe that the MSU calling card really helped us move this project forward as quickly as we did. And that's because MSU has a real brand, and the other land-grant universities have a brand, a trusted brand out in rural communities. But people felt never more supported or empowered. In my research group, one of the books we read is called The Proposal Economy, and it actually comes out of Canada. It's really about the reality that to do community development, and I would say to do sort of environmentally focused community development, you just become a proposal expert. And so that support is something that we as a land-grant should be offering, because it's one of the most critical translational skills that people who are out working on the ground need to have. Another testimony saying the support that we helped bring to this community will help low-income communities in West Side Salt Lake City, which is one of the region's really major urban environmental justice areas. We got good insights. We strengthened our ability to serve our community. So this is what DOGE was going after when they took environmental justice as a kind of political rallying call and terminated our programs. And what I would just ask you is, like, you can stop using the words climate or environmental justice. You can talk about the gold bricks, and you can talk about waste, and you can go after these programs. But in doing that, what have you changed about the sewer challenges facing remote and rural communities? What have you done about Riverton's need for a new recycling truck to serve its disabled tribal adults? I don't think much is happening there, and certainly I can anticipate questions about has philanthropy come in to meet this challenge. We heard about Montana passing some support in the legislature for infrastructure and housing. All of those things are good, but they are the reason that this program was designed, and many of the other programs in the Inflation Reduction Act, that reflected what the real needs are, and those needs have not gone away. So what I want to leave you with is a big pivot to one of the things that has helped kind of like nurture my soul after the loss of this program, which was, honestly completely devastating as a professional. I've never, university professors don't ever have to fire people, but we did have to lay off staff. In the last year, I've been involved in an initiative on campus supported by the College of Letters and Sciences, where with a political theorist, we're visiting the question of the relationship between public things and a functioning democracy. And there's a political theorist that we've used to get these conversations started. And what I really see coming out of this, and the argument of this political theorist, is that our ability to come together to disagree and function as a democracy has long really hinged on the shared public things that we come together to disagree about. And so there's an argument to be made that if we are fighting about our sewer and water, we're actually flexing in important ways our critical muscles of democracy. So I would, one, invite you to all of these events. There's a flyer out there. And second, just ask you to think about and look at the potential that in Montana, our politics will actually get relocalized as these climate disasters hit our infrastructure and our environmental kind of health resources out in community, because there's no better way to get people to the polls than to have the water turn off. And in fact, Northern Cheyenne has had their water turned off for weeks at a time in the last few months, and that's about a 70-year-old water and sewer system that is almost impossible to repair at this point. So I'm hopeful. I think there will be some major catastrophes, and I'm hopeful that these climate catastrophe and infrastructure kind of collisions will produce a new relocalized politics, and I'm interested and excited to see what that looks like.
All right, now for the finale, we have King George III, also known as Isaac Nearing, an outstanding student at Stanford University, but also a fifth-generation Montanan, born and raised in Helena. He's a hiker, a floater, but also an all-around, I'll just say it, a political animal. He knows. He seems to know everyone, but his focus has been on rural and local politics in Montana. It's a little bit odd. You go off to Stanford and the Bay Area, but it actually turns out that at places like the Bill Lane Center and other parts of campus, these concerns can very much be part of the educational experience. And so there's been a lot of times when Isaac has been back in Montana working on research projects, working in the community, just plain old working, actually, from time to time. So he's had a lot of awards. I just want to mention a few of them. A 2025 Truman Scholar representing Montana. That's a big deal. He's led the Stanford Rural Engagement Network. He has done work at our educational farm as well. And then has done work here in Montana, for instance, research and development for the Prickly Pear Land Trust in Helena. I I can go on. He's interned for Senator John Tester in Washington, D.C., involved in youth engagement efforts, local education initiatives, and various volunteer and board roles. And his current thesis research is following the legislative and cultural story of voluntary land conservation. So this is going to be yet another turn of the wheel here. We've talked about different perspectives so far on environmental stewardship, and now we're going to hear from Isaac. So please, you step on up to the podium.
Well, awesome. Thanks for being here today. I'm really excited to get to talk about conservation. Oh, let me go. The future of conservation in this state, and I guess be the last generation down the line. Sorry, not the last generation. Sorry, just today. My presentation is titled "Last Best Forever," based on the last best place. A lot of us have very different understandings of what that might mean. And I want to talk about designing Montana conservation and connection to the land to be sustained. So like Zephyr said, my name's Isaac Nearing. I'm an undergrad in American Studies at Stanford, and I'm also doing a master's in environmental communication down there. But most importantly, I grew up in Helena, Montana. And like a lot of you in the audience probably, this place kind of it very much instills an affection and an admiration for open space, for fresh air, for recreational opportunities. And basically, the gist of this presentation is talking about translating that into the movement that already exists to keep it that way, but also to keep that movement going. So this is me with my dog Skipper on top of Mount Ascension in Helena in the South Hills. We have a really robust trail system that's hiking and biking and all kinds of other activities in Helena, and it is not there on accident. In the 90s and the early 2000s, a group called Prickly Pear Land Trust came together, and they bought up a bunch of parcels in the South Hills as part of the Capitol Backdrop Initiative to keep the scenery behind our state capitol building really intact and also keep open space available to the community. And that sort of inspired me to get involved with conservation and with that group in my own backyard. The summer after my freshman year at Stanford, I came back to Helena and I got to work for Prickly Pear, and I paid a lot of attention to their trails work and how that's really created such a strong connection in the community to the land. But I also got to learn about the much wider swath of their private land conservation. What that entails and why all of us should probably care about private land conservation too. And so fast forward to senior year at Stanford, as Zephyr mentioned, I'm working on a thesis that follows the legal story. It starts with the Constitution in 1972 that Riley talked about, the Clean and Healthful Environment provisions, and that document, the Open Space Act of 1975 that made it so conservation easements could really be a robust force in this state. And then most importantly, takes a look at the 50 years of the cultural significance of saving our Montana identity in the landscape with private land conservation. So I wanted to start out by sharing a lengthy quote with you. All the historians in the room know K. Ross Toole, Montana. Montanans have a strong sense of belonging because of the kindredship of the old and new. All around them are the old sights, old sounds, and old smells of the land itself. A stone's throw from any highway lies the wilderness. The clear pool behind the beaver dam is the same today as it was in the time of the mountain man. There's the same tangle of brush, the same word I can't pronounce trees rise overhead, and the liquid bird song has not changed. Montana is still high, wide, handsome, and remote. There's definitely a long tradition in Montana of describing our deep sense of continuity with this place, that the land feels the same across generations, that what people experience today still resembles something that has existed before. And continuity is really central to how conservation has taken shape here. We see ourselves in the land and our stories in the land, just as Toole writes about here, when we can recognize the land When it's conserved and stays the same over time, that's when those relationships develop with it. For a long time, Montana conservation has really been known for our amazing public lands projects. The national parks, the wilderness areas, and in many ways, those are still the crowning achievements in conservation in the state. But in sort of a new conservation movement in Montana, private land conservation has also taken hold. It really took off in the 90s, a little while after the Open Space Act actually passed. Flying D, right in this area, is one of the big catalysts of that the Nature Conservancy got their hands on to conserve in a good way. But I think private land conservation plays a really important role as sort of the glue in Montana that connects people to the land in a sustained way, because it connects people to the lands that they live and work closest to, and I'll talk about that a little bit more very soon. But there are some very specific, there's some specific reasons why we need private land conservation in Montana. The first of those is the fact that we're a state that just has a lot of it. If we want to conserve at the scale of other places, our neighbors in the Intermountain West, like Idaho or Utah, with lots and lots of public land, we simply have to look towards private properties to keep these large landscapes and habitats intact. The shape of that land also matters. This goes all the way back to the Copper Kings that Riley also spoke about. Our checkerboarding legacy, our railroad grants, that has caused a lot of fragmentation. And so if we do want to have really effective large landscape conservation, we have to look at private land, especially land that abuts public property. The next is the fact that private land is also the most at risk for permanent transformation. And like Terry touched on, our private land ownership rights in Montana are very sacred, and that means that people do a lot of good and bad things with their private land. Perceived abuses, subdivision, mining, dumping, the list it goes on, and people have different feelings about all sorts of different land uses. But the fact is that creates a sort of urgency with private land that we don't have exactly the same with public. And then finally, the most important, in my opinion, is that private land conservation happens where people live and work, like I mentioned. That proximity fosters connection, and that connection sustains the conservation movement. It makes people care, because this is it's the backdrop for their lives. Private land conservation happens on working lands, and it makes it cultural too. And so these factors make private land conservation really perfect for Montana, but also a strong force that's needed throughout the West. And I mean, a good example of it too is growing up in Helena, you're halfway between Yellowstone and Glacier Parks. And I spent a decent amount of time in summer and winter down in the Silvergate area specifically. And Yellowstone is definitely a really treasured place. But it was still a treat to go there. And my sustained connection with the land came from, the far less dramatic landscapes in my own backyard. The ability to step off the front porch and take Skipper up Mount Ascension whenever I want to has made it so that I can see conservation work in my daily life in a very different, much more localized and personal way than necessarily the big ticket objects. And it's important to note that this movement has worked. Over the past 50 years, millions of acres have been protected in conservation easements. If you don't know what that tool is specifically, it's when the private landowner holds on to their land, but they give up certain rights that are tailored to each agreement, such as development, mining, really harsh agricultural practices, so that the conservation character of their property stays intact. A qualified group like Prickly Pear Land Trust checks up on them once a year, and that's made a big splash in Montana. I think the most notable part is, as of very recently, there are conservation easements in all 56 counties in Montana. I think Petroleum and Garfield might have been the last two to have some in their turf. But we know how different from corner to corner our communities are, economics, politics, and the landscapes themselves, so that means something. 6 million private acres is the total number of what's been conserved in this state, and that's out of 93 million. It may not sound like a lot, but it is definitely a huge puzzle piece, along with public land, that has made a difference in that landscape continuity I talked about. So this leads to the main question of this presentation, which is, what will it take for this Montana conservation to be inherited? That was kind of the task I was put up to as the youngin in the group. But I first want to talk about sort of the philosophy that underlies it all. This is what underpins conservation and what we have to sort of center to make it go forward. This movement has worked in large part because of that conservation that centers lived landscapes. So think about working lands, recreational access points, both nostalgic and familiar viewsheds. That makes a difference in sort of our Montana quality of life. We like doing our day-to-day with mountains in the background, our beautiful prairies. And also cultural and historic sites, intertwining that into conservation as well. Our conservation is very much designed to keep things as they are and to fit into people's lives and livelihoods rather than clash with them. And the effect of that may sound a little bit abstract, but it's knowing the land. And when we know the land, we have a relationship with it. When we have a relationship with it, we want to keep it as it is. That sort of is a reciprocal force that's kept conservation intact so far. And the better, more simple word for that is continuity. That is the core of this entire thing. And I do think the foundation of conservation, it's inherently ecological, but it also holds together a lot of other forces in Montana. Terry's also right that it's about culture. It holds together our livelihoods and our identities. And Montana identity is obviously very embedded in the land. And I think what this conservation movement needs to do to sustain itself is to embrace that and to remind people of that. Ellen Malloy puts it really well. Before Alaska came along and ruined everything, 1 of every 25 square miles in America was Montanan. This much space has nurtured a healthy cult of place in which people find perfection, even divinity in the landscape. But the other point of this presentation is to make the point that this continuity is not guaranteed. And being in Bozeman is kind of a prime example of it. It's now a cultural and educational hub in the state. It's definitely changed. I know you guys don't hear enough about it. I know it's changed. I follow the Hipsters of Bozeman Instagram account. It's different than how it was when my dad grew up here. And that's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but in all seriousness, what it does in this area, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, there's massive public conservation, massive private conservation, and now it's competing pretty significantly with lots of different pressures. Throughout the state, we're seeing rising land costs. There's political and policy uncertainty at the state level and, of course, the federal level, too. Subdivision and fragmentation happen because of rising population, and the converse of that is depopulation in rural areas, absentee land ownership, values can be lost, and that's a challenge because that's where a lot of our open space is at. And so I'll lead us back to the question, what exactly is the recommendation for how to preserve Montana conservation and pass it on? Well, the foundation is connection, and so I think we should think about how to preserve connection first and foremost. If for conservation to be inherited, it has to hold together a few things at once. Keeping the landscape intact and preserving habitat is functionally what it's all about, but there's a lot of other factors that conservationists may not traditionally have to consider that need to be considered today. The first of those is that ecological integrity, ensuring the land itself remains healthy and functional, and also advocating for conservation for what it is on its own. Saving land is effective for our wildlife, but also our communities, people, our economy relies on this, especially as it becomes increasingly based on tourism and outdoor access. Sometimes in tension with that, though, is still the economic viability piece. And a lot of this is about keeping working lands working. It's about keeping people close to the land who are already close to it. And that's most pronounced in an agricultural and succession sense on farms and ranches. But I think it's also important for conservationists to take a balanced view about, in the land use conversation, sustainable housing and making sure the next generation has a way to stay in this state and not sever their connection with the land is very important, whether or not they live on a farm or whether or not they're from an urban or rural background too. And then making sure the durable legal tools stay intact and that political support is there. Over the past couple legislative sessions, there's been attacks, at least attempts to declaw the Open Space Act, to limit the term lengths of conservation easements, to get rid of it entirely. And we have really great statewide and national advocacy groups in this state, but the Corps could probably attest to this, but maybe the stories that resonate the most are when the small land trust like Prickly Pear shows up, or the farmers and ranchers that have conserved their land. And we need more of that in the legislature to keep these tools intact. Luckily, all the attacks so far have been shot down in a pretty bipartisan manner, but that doesn't mean we should take that support today for granted. And then the last factor is maintaining a culture of stewardship. And I think this is one place where showing and telling really makes a big difference. We need to show our neighbors, our family members in the community where conservation is actually taking shape. Prickly Pear has one easement along the Missouri River called the Canyon Cattle Ranch, and I never knew that it was intentionally conserved over some 15, 20 plus years of floating that 5-mile stretch with my family from Craig to Mid-Canyon Campground. And now that I do know that it is a conserved place, about the work that went into that, there's a much deeper respect for conservation and an urgency to keep that kind of work going. But it's also telling. It is being forceful and letting the next generation know, as well as your neighbors who may have forgotten it, that what a Montanan is someone who cares about the land and has a relationship in naming those values outright. And so I understand these are a little bit abstract, so I want to leave us with a few specific points, a few specific policy proposals before I end this conversation right here. The first is investing in connection and education, trying to create real exposure to conservation. That means making sure the next generation has real experiences with these landscapes through educational programs, through field trips, public access projects being prioritized, sometimes turning private land into public land when possible, and even opportunities in the industry. That entry point for me as a young person wanting to come back to this state and work in conservation was really critical. Next is conserving across different communities. And this is important because it grounds conservation in its grassroots strength that has been ongoing, but we also need to evangelize a little bit. We need to expand the movement. And that means bridging conservation across political divides, economic divides, and cultural divides as well. There's two good examples of Prickly Pear's work in this area as well. In East Helena, about 10, 15 minutes from downtown Helena, this is an old lead smelter town, and it has seen economic decline since that smelter industry has decreased. Prickly Pear transformed a former Superfund site into a public park. They completely recreated the environment as maybe what it was really like 100 years ago before that smelter existed. And it created access in a place where it may have not been as visible politically, but where it needed to become more commonplace and where it touched people who may have not had as much exposure to open land before. And another example on this note, the bottom bullet point here, working with tribal communities. Prickly Pear recently finished the first official cultural and conservation easement in the state in the Big Belt Mountains. That's on the Avalanche Ranch, which has Blackfeet owners. And the legal agreement as part of conservation is conserving the tribal practices, customs, and anything that those landowners prescribed as part of their culture in the landscape. The last point is supporting people staying on the land. I want to go back to this in that agricultural and succession sense, but also over the fact that conservationists do have a voice in that broader land use discussion. If we want to keep people's connection to the land intact, we need to also talk about smart, sustainable, affordable housing in urban places like this, and also rural places in this state where people have to leave because they can't afford to live there either. Conservation simply does not last if the people connected cannot remain. So hopefully that was not too dreary. At the end of the day, what drives conservation is both these technical recommendations, but also really just a pure love of the land that motivates us in our core. Bruce, as well as Bob and John, are three of the conservation greats in this state, and they just finished a book called Saving the Big Sky that chronicles the whole history that I've tried to give you a little glimpse of today. I wanted to share their quotes. "Montana fills our eyes with beauty and our souls with hope. Beyond maps, species, and biogeography, what drives people to conserve is a love of the land, a truth worth repeating. And so I hope the takeaway is that there is a bright future for conservation in Montana, especially private land conservation, if we plan for it. And the hope is that that truth can be repeated for generations to come. I'm excited to talk about it more in our conversation, and thanks for listening today.
Okay, thank you so much, Isaac. That was fantastic. It's often the case in these events that we say, well, the next generation will save us, right? They'll figure it out. But I think we're off to a good start here. So thank you so much. We have about 20 minutes, roughly. Okay, a relatively short amount of time. I want to make sure that people in the audience have a chance, if they have any burning questions that they want to ask, put your hands up, and we'll have the folks with the microphones coming around. You know, in the short term, just thinking about the three presentations, it struck me that there are some interesting points that I'd be eager to hear more about if we have time. Again, reserving most of the time for the audience. But, you know, Terry, in your presentation, it made me think or wonder, like, when you're thinking about values and culture and how that relates to this, like, deeper commitment to the market mechanisms, are there ways that you can kind of measure or incorporate values into thinking formally about these questions? Maybe, you know, you're the economist, so revealed preferences or you know, ways to kind of think about operationalizing these really important concepts that you brought up. And then Julia, I was really struck by how important that concept of connecting communities to resources and opportunities that relate to environmental protection, conservation, and justice, and just how important it is. You know, it's one thing to know that communities need these resources, but it's entirely another to provide the kind of, it's almost like the software, it's the connective tissue that allows things to proceed. That seems like just such an important area of focus. And I'm wondering on that front, and I would assume it's the case from your presentation, there's a dimension here where the communities are actively also shaping the kinds of opportunities or support that are being offered, you know, so kind of getting away from, as we all know as academics, a lot of times we have to write to the grant or write to the proposal, you know, RFP, whereas our own heartfelt needs and desires, you know, may exist on a slightly different plane. So I'd be curious about how that, like, dialogue maybe exists within that system. And then Isaac, my question for you, fantastic presentation, but I'm wondering, like, if we're relying on private conservation as a key kind of element in the portfolio for these important aims that you adumbrated in your presentation, you know, to what extent do you still kind of think of that as a relational kind of process where, because when I think of private, I just kind of think about the individual who's not you know, not necessarily beholden to any other party or just has to operate within some, like, minimal institutional setting. But, like, I kind of get it from your presentation that you're thinking about this multi-generational kind of, like, the private is really more than just individuals, but it's families embedded in communities that then anyhow, wondering whether that's kind of where you're going with that. I'd like to hear more. So those are just, if, you know, maybe real quick, if y'all want to say something in regard to my questions. Terry, if you want, come on up, yeah.
I don't want to come up, I just forgot my most important hat.
The accountant.
hat.
The accountant. Yeah.
So, and I was afraid when you talked about my last slide just being culture, you were going to take my degree away. So at least I got my economist hat on. And I got this when somebody asked me, you know what an economist is, don't you? And the answer was someone who's pretty good with numbers but doesn't have enough personality to be an accountant. Anyway, I think that's perhaps a good way to answer your question about the connection between what I was really thinking about is customs and how we preserve them, and then how does that integrate into markets. To me, when I put this hat on, markets are places where people express their values. And American Prairie, for example, is expressing the organization's values, as Isaac was talking about, but that's an agglomeration of a bunch of values of people who said, we'll give you some money to do this. And I champion that. That's a market at its finest. And the values that I think American Prairie or Prickly Pear or Montana Land Reliance, all those are values that incorporate things that we don't usually think of as markets. That is, you know, the bottle of water or the pen or whatever. But they are values, and they're important values. And as we have gotten richer as a country, those values rise up relative to a little more salt on the table. And I think that at the local level, when those take place, I think everything Isaac was talking about are cases where at a small scale, those values are articulated. They're articulated between willing sellers and willing buyers. And there's I think this is what Isaac was saying, there's a real connection between the buyers and the sellers in those cases. And I think I was intrigued and will press Isaac a little more on, well, when we have large landscape scale conservation, does that run into a problem? How do we articulate those values across large landscapes? I know what the value of my backyard is, but I don't quite know what the value of an acre of land in the middle of the Bob Marshall is. And so do we lose some of the value part? But we definitely, as we increase the scale, I think that's when we run into problems with custom.
Thank you. Yeah, Isaac, do you want to just respond real quick? How big can it go?
How big can we go? I don't know. I have my own issue. I got to talk to landowners this past summer in central Montana, and the same challenges that you talked about with American Prairie were abundantly clear in those conversations. And I don't have the exact answer about what the maximum scale of private land conservation can be to still get local support. I do know that I see Prickly Pear merch all around Helena, and there's definitely a grassroots support for that organization that's only conserved about 30,000 acres in total in the Helena area, but that's still made a big difference. I do tend to think that kind of smaller scale is good, but Montana Land Reliance is probably the largest state-based land trust in the country. They've conserved over 1 million acres. They have a book about it. And they, too, definitely have a pretty good reputation. So Terry's probably better expert on that. But I wanted to add, too, to your question. I didn't get into the nitty-gritty of how these conservation easements are figured out, but there is definitely a public-private partnership that is super integral to all of them. Counties kind of nominally approve or disapprove of the easements, but there is a financial benefit to the landowners in most cases, relatively. It's usually limited in terms of what they could sell their land if they subdivided it and gain from that too. So there's definitely a trade-off, and that's the whole point, that conservation values get put first. But in terms of the public being invested in it, open space bonds are kind of the expression of that. Canning Cattle, for example, the landowners got compensated with Helena open space bond funds for donating their conservation easement. And that's something Helena voters, or Lewis and Clark County voters, approved explicitly because they want those landscapes intact. So I do think it's relational beyond just the families and the landowners themselves. I know I'll never own 4,000 acres of Missouri riverfront property, but at least I get to float by it several times a summer every year. So there is still that value in proximity and knowing that part of our heritage is intact, even if I'm not the one who's ranching that land.
Thank you. Julia, do you, you can either answer.
I'll weigh in. Like if APR asks me what I think they should do, which they haven't, but I just think the good neighbor agreement that comes out of Montana's history with mining, and I should say one of the things Montana is most important for in the conservation space is championing this idea of an agreement between industry and the communities that host it. This has gone on to be a widespread model for getting over the impasse around big renewable infrastructure siting. And that agreement, really, a couple things I would say about it. In the case of the original Good Neighbor Agreement with the Stillwater mine, I won't go into all the details, like there has to be a risk of some regulatory risk to the company, or a reputational risk that they won't get their permit or they can't operate. So APR, I think, has some reputational risks, and I have advocated to consider a Good Neighbor Agreement process. And I think whenever you're talking about someone with a huge amount of power and wealth showing up in a place, and let's be clear also, like rural landowners are very wealthy in the assets that they have. So I think we need to be a little bit careful, but there just are these power dynamics. And so good neighbor agreements can be a way to talk about that and negotiate that. And I think could be a place to put a lot of these conversations. The bison issue is a whole nother thing. I want to answer your question about relationships as the kind of software for capacity building and kind of community self-determination when it comes to solving environmental and climate justice issues. Our model for how we built and delivered the TICTAC comes out of 20 years of working in resource-dependent and underserved communities and understanding that what makes one place different from the next, sort of the policy environment, assuming being relatively the same, is individuals and the kind of capacity that individuals have to bring resources into the community. And obviously those individuals often are the ways that ideas get shared out of the community. So Laura Nolan in Winnett is a person who is sharing that model back out through the world. So these conduits are based on relationships, and those relationships take time. And those relationships are not the metrics by which grants or research grants or philanthropy typically measure their outcomes. But you absolutely can't get anywhere without those relationships. So that's what we took a lot of our money in the TICTAC into doing, was just putting people out there with the mandate to just establish relationships. And on the side of self-determination in terms of what these things should look like, absolutely that was the idea. And now we're back in a model, I think, where communities are having to fit their priorities into what is available and less self-determination.
Thank you. We have time for one question, only one question from the audience. Does anyone have a question? We have a question. Do we have a microphone? Okay, right over here, Cora. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your presentations. I just want to underscore what Isaac shared about showing up at the legislature. If anybody doesn't know, we saw the 2 days where the Capitol was most packed. One was around unions and the other was around conservation easements, and it made a really big difference. So definitely show up, it matters. Talking about how we value this land, want to talk, if you have legislative ideas, please let me know. But one of the things I've been trying to follow is carbon credit, right? Like the value of the quality of our soil. So I'm wondering if, I'm sorry if I missed any of you talking about that, but I'm just wondering if we can kind of bring that back, because it's certainly valuable for climate and valuable for valuing the land. I'll
first just say that we have he's not a washed up old soil scientists. We have a leading expert in soil carbon, Tony Hartshorn, in the back of the audience, and he's probably the best person to answer this. So you guys go after it if you want to talk about soil carbon markets and the struggle that they've had to get off. You need to build the market, and that's policy-based would be my answer. But if you want to get at the science, just make sure you catch up with Tony in the back of the room. You want to take that one on?
I'll just say that the carbon markets are exploding. I don't mean like they are in Iran, but I mean exploding in the coverage of them. I run a program at Hoover for enviropreneurs. If anybody's interested, take a look at the Hoover website, or you have my email. This is a group of people who are working in the private sector, trying to find ways to solve environmental problems generally, but almost everyone that we have come through has some connection with carbon credits. We can do this and we'll get carbon credits. We can do that and we'll get carbon credits. And the values of those are going up because I think the security of the property rights, to use my terms, in those carbon credits is increasing. All that said, I had I was very skeptical about carbon credits early on when I was invited to speak at be a bomb thrower at a Wall Street Journal conference on economics, it was called. And after one of the people spoke, he was the chairman of CEO of General Electric. And I said, yeah, all this stuff you're talking about why you should get carbon credits is great for you because you're the 900-pound gorilla on K Street in Washington, D.C. What about all the people who are in smaller businesses, farms, and so on? And he said, quote, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that was it. And that made me a little more skeptical about, well, if all we're going to do is create carbon credits that GE gets, but we don't get them down to the dirt in Montana, then I'm not sure it's such a great thing. But I think we've done better than Mr. Immelt wanted.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know we're hungry. But on a bit of a tangent, carbon markets aren't necessarily my area of expertise, but one thing I didn't really get to in the presentation was the importance of innovation in our private land techniques. And easements is a huge one, but it's definitely far from the only thing. And one of the great projects happening in the same corner where American Prairie is the Nature Conservancy's Grass Bank up in Phillips County. And essentially with their private land and with surrounding private land, they let ranchers graze on the ranch land that they own up there in exchange for those ranchers having rotational grazing or other more sustainable regenerative practices. That still honors private land rights, and that still is a form of private land conservation, and it's helping with carbon sequestration in the soil when they adopt those. So yeah, markets are not something I know too much about, but I do know there's a lot of ways that we should also be exploring to integrate climate into our private land conservation. Yeah.
Thank you. Awesome. Okay, that's it for our second panel. Could we get a round of applause for our panelists? Wonderful.